Today we're going to learn about the French. Now, the French were the next group of settlers to come to Louisiana after the Native Americans, who were the first settlers to come to Louisiana. And the French had different homes, and they had different clothes, and they were much different from the Native Americans, but they had a big impact on Louisiana, so we're going to find out why. Our first question becomes, where did the French come from? Well, France is across the Atlantic Ocean. Here's Louisiana. We go across the ocean to Europe, and here is France. The French came to North America and traveled through rivers and lakes and down the Mississippi River to Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico. Now, why did the French travel across the ocean and through rivers and lakes all the way to Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico? Well, the French did it to trade on the Mississippi River. This happened before the days of cars and highways, and before those days and those inventions were created, rivers were like the highways through the land. They were much easier to travel on than mountains and forests and things like that. So rivers were very important, and the French came to trade on the Mississippi River. The Native Americans had many things that they wanted, and they had many things the Native Americans wanted. Now that we have that background knowledge, we can start answering questions like this that we saw in the last MLQ. The map shows us that most French settlers in Louisiana lived A. along the Gulf Coast, B. in the northwestern part of the state, C. along the Mississippi River, or D. near Native American villages. And we see that the shaded area shows where early French settlers lived, so we know that they lived along the Mississippi River. We also know that the French came to Louisiana to trade on the Mississippi River. So we have two clues that tell us that C is going to be our answer. Now, how did the French survive Louisiana's environment? I brought some text that will help answer that question. In 1722, because the Mississippi River was so important for trade and defense, France made New Orleans the headquarters of Louisiana. Other French settlers sent extra food down the Mississippi to New Orleans because the farms in Louisiana were not successful at first. The lower country of Louisiana depended on food from other French settlers for survival through much of the 1700s. Now, this text gives us two ideas, and we want to make notes to this side. We would do this on a test or in our notes. We want to make notes to the side of the text, pulling out the main ideas. So first, I see New Orleans is important for trade. Mississippi was important for trade and defense, so New Orleans was the headquarters. I also see that settlers in Louisiana depended on others for food. Other French settlers sent extra food down the Mississippi. Louisiana depended on the food from other French settlers. So they didn't have their own food. So how did the French survive in Louisiana's environment? They had to trade. Now, this means that they didn't adapt as well as the Native Americans, who were able to live and get all their own food from the environment in Louisiana. Now, how did the French impact Louisiana? Well, this is a picture of a city in Europe where the French settlers came from. And you can see that they brought a lot of their customs to Louisiana because this isn't very different from your regular New Orleans brass band. So they brought their music, as we see some of these instruments came from Europe, and they brought them to New Orleans and to Louisiana. They brought their religion. The French were Catholic, and they started Catholic churches here in New Orleans and Louisiana. They also brought their food, and they also brought the celebration of Mardi Gras. Mardi Gras is actually French for Fat Tuesday. So, on the back of your worksheet, you have a chart of your European explorers. First, we have De Soto, who was an explorer who crossed the Mississippi, but he didn't settle because he was looking for gold and silver. Then we had La Salle, who was the first explorer to claim Louisiana. Remember, he wanted that Mississippi River for trade. And then we had two brothers, Bienville and Iberville, who founded the city of New Orleans. That means they started it. They wanted a city near the Gulf of Mexico so they could trade easily. Fill in the names of these European explorers onto your chart on your worksheet. Now, let's take a map and figure out why did they pick where New Orleans is? Well, New Orleans is actually a meeting point between the river, the Mississippi River, and Lake Pontchartrain that opens up into the Gulf of Mexico. So New Orleans is a perfect place for trade between these two areas. So that's why they started a city in New Orleans. Now, we can also put this information into what we call a timeline. Here's a timeline of Louisiana settlers. First, we have the Native Americans who came and settled on the Mississippi River and in all the areas of Louisiana for the natural resources. Next, we have DeSoto, who we saw in our chart, who crosses the Mississippi River but doesn't stay because he's looking for gold. We also have La Salle, who claimed Louisiana and the Mississippi for France. We have the two brothers who started the city of New Orleans. Now, a timeline puts this information into a picture that we can then see the order in which they happened. We can see the sequence of events just like we would for a story. So the Native Americans are first, they're earlier, then DeSoto crosses it, then La Salle claims it, then the two brothers start the city of New Orleans. Now today we talked about the French. We're going to remember that they came to trade on the Mississippi River, and they brought their language, their religion, their music, and their food to New Orleans, and they shaped it in a big way. A lot of the streets in our city are named after French settlers like La Salle, Iberville, Bienville. Those are all names of streets here in New Orleans because they were so important to the history of New Orleans. We're going to learn about more settlers next time, and I'll see you then.